Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Suglia, and I will be summarizing Hegel's 1807 text, The Phenomenology of Spirit. I will be moving very quickly and covering a great deal of ground, so you might have to pause the video frequently. So let me begin. Hegel is describing the stages of human consciousness, from its most rudimentary level to absolute knowledge. The phenomenology of spirit tracks, traces, charts a sequence of mental failures. Each step, each stage that consciousness passes through is a failure. The human mind must go through a succession of various catastrophes before it reaches absolute knowledge. Now, the first stage of human knowledge is sensible certainty, which is the awareness of the bare hexiety of a thing, its thisness. Sensible certainty is overturned by language. As soon as a thing is named, it loses its individuality and is replaced by a sensible generality. When I say this cat, my words could apply to any felid with equal acuity or vacuity. The second stage is perception, holding something to be true. At this stage, I perceive something as an amalgam of discrete qualities or alsos. This piece of cheese is waxy and also yellow and also pungent and also delicious. However, when I perceive an object, I do not grasp the object as a totality. I only perceive its disconnected properties. The third stage is that of the understanding. I experience an object in relation to other objects. My knowledge is relational. However, this knowledge is imperfect, for it is purely scientific. I understand scientific laws, but in doing so, the understanding only understands itself. I fail to account for the sensible world in which we all immediately live. The world is turned upside down. The world is inverted. At this stage, having overcome the understanding, human consciousness desires objects in order to destroy them. We desire to master the world around us through action. Desire desires the destruction of the object of desire, but once the object of our desire is destroyed, we lose mastery over that object. Once we get what we want, we don't want it anymore. When we get the object of our desire, the object of desire is destroyed. And with the vanishing of the object of our desire, we no longer know who we are. So now we move from consciousness of objects to the activities of self-consciousness. Now I am fronted by another human being, and I front another human being. One self-consciousness fronts another self-consciousness, and the first is submerged into the second. The self cannot re-emerge from its submergence into the other. We identify with those who, by analogy, are like us, and we contest with them. I want you to acknowledge me, but I don't want to acknowledge you. I want you to acknowledge me, but I don't want to acknowledge you. This leads to a struggle for acknowledgement. This is the struggle to extract recognition from the other human being. Bear the freedom of the other person from our desire for recognition. It is often a struggle at which life itself is at stake. One of us will end up master, and the other will end up slave. Otherwise, one of us will end up alive, and the other will end up dead. Each self-consciousness is a master or a slave in relation to another self-consciousness. Instead of killing the other person, we turn the other person into our slave. The slave, of course, is dissatisfied with this arrangement and becomes a stoic. Think Epictetus. He or she pretends to ascend to the universality of thought. But this is not the goal of consciousness, not yet. The rationalism of the Stoic is quickly dogmatized, and the Stoic becomes the skeptic, someone who is distrustful of the world of appearances, but skepticism is an anti-philosophical position. The skeptic then transforms into the unhappy consciousness, which is a divided self. The unhappy consciousness is a self which is at variance with itself. On the one hand, the unhappy consciousness imagines that it is able to loft into the loftiness of pure thought, ataraxia, unperturbedness. On the other hand, the unhappy consciousness valorizes thought as something above itself, something unobtainable. So the unhappy consciousness is unhappy because it believes it can surpass the world of appearances, yet it knows that such a power is forever beyond its capabilities. The unhappy consciousness overcomes itself by delivering itself into the hands of the priest. The unhappy consciousness does not pray in a petitionary manner any longer. Now he or she prays intercessionally through the mediation of the priest. The priest acts as the mediator to the changeless beyond. For reasons that escape me, the priest allows for a transition from religiosity to genuine rationalism. It should be remembered that the unhappy consciousness is the precedential stage for the accession to reason. The subjective idealism of Kant is likewise rejected. For Kant, only what is mine is absolute reality. But this makes of Kant a skeptic, not a philosopher. Hegel is contemptuous of Kant. He objurgates against Kant. He fulminates against him. Kant thinks that the world is incomprehensible. We impose the forms of the sensibility and the forms of the understanding onto the world and only know what we construct. Hegel, by contrast, believes that the world is already rationally comprehensible. The world is intelligible. The world is legible. Nothing in the world is unknowable by reason for Hegel. For Kant, the world is mind constructive. For Hegel, the world is already rationally constructed. The world is a reflection of human reason. Human reason is a reflection of the world, for Hegel. Kant's subjective idealism is frustrated and frustrating, so the mind turns to observing nature. The categories that we impinge upon nature are arbitrary and inadequate. What does the category crustacean have to do with a lobster? Nothing, really. So the mind turns to observe the minds of other human beings. The laws of social determinism are rejected by Hegel. Social psychology cannot explain why some of us conform to the norms of society and some of us do not. The environment does not determine our future actions, nor does the shape of our faces, nor does the structure of our skulls. Physiognomy and phrenology are repudiated. Good on Hegel for that. The form of our ears does not determine our actions. Now the human mind activates itself. It becomes active in its attempts to master the world. Hegel admires the ancient Greeks for sacrificing their individuality to the state. For Hegel is nothing if not a conformist. Unfortunately, the collision between the desires of the individual and the demands of the state are inescapable, and this leads to tragedy, as we shall see. And now the human being, having failed at subsumption beneath the state, becomes a hedonist. Self-enjoyment becomes one's life's goal. But enjoyment for its own sake, when pursued as a universal principle, is contentless, one-sided, and doomed to failure. Having failed at self-enjoyment, the mind turns to social reform. The mind thinks that it cares only for the rescue of humanity, but it fails to understand that its social justice campaigning is really a form of selfishness after all. And so the law of the heart becomes the frenzy of self-conceit. And now the virtuous person sees the establishment as corrupt, as heartless, as cruel even. The institution is evil, man. Yet another failure is undergone, and now the mind demands to be appreciated for the works that it produces. But this is also a catastrophe, for the mind only ultimately experiences joy in itself. So the human being tries its hand at morality, but it finds all of the moral slogans to be formalistic, legalistic, empty. The golden rule, for example, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, that sounds all well and good until one recognizes that what I would like someone to do to me might not be in that person's best interest. Another moral formula is always tell the truth. But what if what I believe in is a lie? Human consciousness now moves from the vacuity of moral sloganeering to living ethically, or trying to. In ancient Greece, there was a harmonization between the state and the intimate sphere of the family, between divine law and state law. A human being in such a setting was equally a member of the family and a member of the state. Fascinatingly, Hegel thinks that the relationship between brother and sister is stronger than the relationship between husband and wife. The wife represents divine law and familial law, for Hegel, don't blame me, whereas the husband represents state law. Brother and sister are complemental in a way in which husband and wife are not. According to Hegel, not I. Not me, I should say. That's bad English. Sorry. But this too instigates a problem. Remember that this book traces out a series of failures, a sequence of failed conditions. Antigone wants to bury her brother Polychene. But in doing so, she would be following the divine law, yet contravening the law of the state. The collision between the divine and the governmental gives rise to tragedy. Now in modernity, now in the modern world, nature is estranged from culture. Nature is estranged from culture. And the individual is estranged from the state. Modern consciousness experiences an irreconcilable contradiction. Either self-interest is seen as bad and the state is seen as good, or the state is seen as bad and self-interest is seen as good. Either way, the state and the individual are incommensurable in the modern world. In the modern world, noble and ignoble interchange. Consciousness becomes noble by sacrificing itself to the state. But this very same consciousness becomes vulgar, base, ignoble once it feels arrogant, once it resents the fact that it is dependent upon a higher order, the state. This is what Hegel calls the self-alienated spirit. The self is disillusioned by the estrangements of the modern world, and either becomes faithful by turning to the beyond, or insightful by turning inward. The alienated spirit either exteriorizes itself or interiorizes itself. Both positions are flawed. Hegel's riposte is that faith sees the beyond as, well, beyond the self, whereas enlightenment is really just another form of faith. The self now subscribes to the social contract. But this is also a problematical standpoint. According to social contract theory, the self should give up its self-interest in favor of the general will. That sounds fine. However, Hegel rejoins that each individual has a different concept of the general will, which leads to a tumult of selfish desires, a welter of individual cravings. How am I supposed to know what the general will is? Worse still, the social contract leads to massacres, such as the Reign of Terror. If I sacrifice all of my particular traits for the sake of some general will, how can I not feel alienated from the structures of society? In the Reign of Terror, sanguinary death has no more significance than drinking water or cutting off the head of a cabbage. This is what happens when you generalize a particular without absorbing it. The murder of individual human beings becomes abstractable. The self now subscribes to the social contract, but this is also a problematical standpoint. All right. And here is a disjunction between the moral world and the natural world that must be healed. The self at this stage turns inward, avoids work, avoids activity, avoids doing anything productive. The self at this stage becomes the beautiful soul. Now, the beautiful soul has a conscience, but it is terrified of sullying its inner sphere by engaging with the world outside of its head. Unhappily, the beautiful soul is also rectitudinous. In other words, it thinks that it is holier than everyone else in the world. So the distinctions between faith and reason, between morality and the natural world, between transcendence and the mundane, between the individual and society must all be bridged over. All of the tears, all of the conflicts, all of the contradictions that rend the modern world. And how are they bridged over? By rational religiosity, by a way of thinking that is both religious and philosophical at the same time. By a consciousness that perceives the divine in the fleshly, right? In the earthly, in the floral, in the faunal, in the human, and in art. The way in which the mind elevates to this higher status is by recognizing that absolute being is subject. In other words, God is human, and the human is divine. God is at once substance and subject at the same time. We have moved from the immediate knowledge, which is sensible certainty, to absolute knowledge. Absolute knowledge perceives the absolute in the finite. Absolute knowledge also consists in the recognition that each individual thing in the world is both in itself and for itself. What does this mean? Both a self-subsistent thing and an object of consciousness at the same time. The end.